All right, so today we talk about predicate logic, begin talking about it, and we'll begin by saying why we need predicate logic, and then we'll introduce a couple of our basic concepts, namely predicates and names, and then we'll try to be clear about what we mean when we say that predicate logic is an extension of propositional logic. All right, so why do we need predicate logic? Well, a simple way to answer that is to notice that there are some arguments that seem to be intuitively valid that we really can't prove to be valid using propositional logic. So here's an example. All birds have wings. Some birds can't fly. So some things with wings can't fly. Now, that probably seems valid to you, and as a matter of fact, it is valid. In fact, we skipped chapter 5 on categorical logic, but categorical logic does allow you to, in a certain pictorial sense, prove relationships like this. And so just briefly to see how, you may even be familiar with this method. If you draw what we call a Venn diagram and label each of these interlocking circles with one of the categories involved in this argument is actually called a syllogism or a categorical syllogism. So you can let the one circle stand for birds, one circle stand for wings, and the other circle stand for things that fly. And so all birds have wings tells us that anything that's a bird is fully contained within the category of things that have wings. And another way of saying that this is that everything outside here, out here, is non-existent. So we just sort of get rid of all that stuff. So that means that all the birds are left in the things with wings or the things that fly. Now, we're also told that some birds cannot fly, which means that there's at least one little birdie that is over here in the area of things with wings that are birds, but also can't fly. That's not in the flying circle. And so the conclusion is that some winged things can't fly. And as a matter of fact, that's exactly what we've demonstrated, because there is a thing designated by this X that is in the wing circle, but not in the flying circle. So that's a kind of proof, but it's not a proof in the form that we have learned. And so predicate logic is going to show us how to extend propositional logic to deal with arguments like this. Now, the reason that propositional logic just can't handle this is because if we translated this into propositional logic, we'd have to treat each one of these as a distinct atomic proposition. So all birds have wings might be P, and some birds can fly would be Q, so some birds can't fly would be not Q, and then some winged things can fly would be R, so some winged things can't fly would be not R. But clearly, P, not Q, therefore not R, is invalid. So propositional logic fails us at this level. So predicate logic fixes this issue by basically showing us the internal structure of propositions, specifically categorical propositions like all P are Q or some P are Q. Now, in this lecture, we're not going to show how to deal with those, because before we do that, we need to learn some of the more basic innovations, and that is predicates and names. In the next lecture, we'll learn how to characterize propositions like all are or some are, which involve introducing a tool called a quantifier, and there's two kinds of quantifiers, the existential quantifier and the universal quantifier, but that's all for next time. Okay, so what do we do this time? Well, let's talk about predicates and names. So consider a proposition like this. Frida is logical. Now, this proposition uses the name Frida, just like you have a name, Frida, to refer to a particular thing. A person is a particular kind of thing. And it also uses the predicate, logical. And predicate, we call something a predicate because it ascribes a certain kind of property. Predicates designate properties. So being logical is a property that is being ascribed to or predicated of Frida. So in predicate logic, we represent predicates with capital letters like A, B, and C, and we designate objects or things with lowercase letters like little a, little b, little c. Okay, so in predicate logic, Frida might be represented with a little f, and the property being logical might be represented with a big L. Now, in predicate logic, by convention, we write the predicate first and the name afterwards. So Frida is logical would actually be written like this if we used F and L for that purpose. So this actually sort of says logical Frida, right? But it's the translation in predicate logic of Frida is logical. So it's important to understand right from the beginning that in English, English is just not predicate logic. It's different, and we've adopted some different conventions for different reasons. So in English, we capitalize names typically, but in predicate logic, we don't. And also in English sentences, it's more common really for the name to precede the predicate, at least in simple sentences. So Frida is logical. Frida came first. And yet in predicate logic, we've reversed the order. So it can feel a little backwards at first, and you're just going to need to get used to that. Okay, so in predicate logic, names always refer to specific objects, whereas predicates refer to classes or categories that can be ascribed to or predicated of these objects. So this is a simple thing to say, but it can be confusing when you start to get into actually translating things. So if you look at these two propositions, Frida is logical and humans are logical. These look very similar on the surface. And most people who are new to predicate logic will see the second proposition as being pretty much the same as the first. And grammatically, it is indeed similar. In fact, if you know grammar, you know that both Frida and humans are sometimes called names. Humans are Frida is a proper name, and humans is sometimes called a general name. But humans are not names in logic. Frida is a name because it picks out a specific thing. If we say Frida, we're referring to a specific person. But if we say human, we're not referring to a specific human. I mean, we could name somebody human if we wanted to, but human typically refers to a kind or class or category of things. So whereas it would be perfectly correct to write logical Frida as the translation of Frida is logical, it turns out that it's not correct to write, say, for example, logical human as humans are logical. That's not right because both humans and logical are predicates. So in the second proposition, there are no names. Both human and logical are predicates. So you might say, well, okay, well, how do we translate this? Right? How do we translate that? And the answer is there is going to be a way to translate that, but we don't actually know how to do it yet. And we won't learn until the next lecture. Okay, so the distinction between predicates and names is pretty easy to keep clear with a proposition like Andy is a fish, which would translate as F-A, capital F-A. But it's easy to get confused when we consider a proposition like a salmon is a fish, because you might be initially tempted to translate this as, say, FS, big S little f, or big F little s, or even big S little f, or big S big F, excuse me. But none of these are right, and the reason is because both salmon and fish are predicates, right? A fish is a category or a kind of, say, animal, and a salmon is a kind of fish. They're both kinds of objects. So there's no names in here, and as before, we don't have the capacity yet to translate a proposition like this. Okay, so to further clarify this point, it's also helpful to notice that most objects in the world just do not have names, right? So we give people, planets, pets, mountains, lakes, rivers, roads, businesses, states, cities, countries, parks, etc., names because we find it convenient to pick specific members of these categories out with just one word or expression. But the majority of objects in the world, like, say, the blades of grass in your yard or the socks in your dresser drawer, they don't have names. You could give them names, right, if you wanted to, if you were that kind of person who wanted to name your socks or the blades of grass in your yards. Sometimes we, might name our car Bessie, or you might name your kitchen Matilda. You can do that. It turns out that actually our ability to name anything we want to is something we take advantage of in predicate logic. And we'll see that down the road. So you can also get confused easily by the fact that lots of words in the English language function as names sometimes and as predicates other times. So, for example, you take a word like mom, right? Well, as you know, sometimes mom gets capitalized because we use mom as a name. We just call our mom mom and treat it as a name. But sometimes we'll say your mom, right? And say so if we talk about moms as a category, then of course it gets treated like a predicate. So Sarah is a mom, treats mom as a predicate, and so we would translate that as capital M little s. But if we say mom's pissed, then we're saying using mom as a name, and now pissed is a predicate and mom is a name. And some predicates now, like logical, green, happy television, pink stick, flower, eggplant, of course there's millions of them, we call one-place predicates. And this means that the corresponding property relates to just one object and the predicate hooks up to just one name, and just in the way we've been doing. So we can say that something is a television, something is pink, something is an eggplant. But there are also two-place predicates. We sometimes call these relations. And what makes them relations is that they relate two or more objects together. So take something like Bob loves George. Well, that's a relation between Bob and George, right? And so we have a different way of writing this. It follows the same sort of basic idea. But what we do is we write the predicate first, just like before, but then we write the names afterwards. Okay, so again, this reads kind of oddly. This is big L, little b, little g, and this says that Bob loves George. So theoretically, we can actually have predicates with as many places as we like. We can call them multiplace predicates. But in English, it's pretty rare to have more than three. There are a lot of common three-place predicates. So you take a predicate like recommend, right? You can use recommend as a two-place predicate sometimes, but it's more commonly a three-place predicate. So we can say Megan recommended Juanita to Vernon. And the way we would write that is simply recommend, right, big R, MJV. Megan recommended Juanita to Vernon. So notice that it was important here that the predicate R is relating three objects together. We don't have the resource, three, I should have emphasized, the three objects together, right? We don't yet have the resources to represent a sentence like this. Megan recommended a restaurant to Vernon, right? And the reason is that restaurant is a category, right? It's a predicate. And so right now we don't have the ability to represent that properly. So lots of English words actually can function as either one-place or two-place predicates depending on how they're used. So here, you don't have to memorize these or anything, but just to see how this looks. Like if we say Barry is funny, that would be capital F, little b, but we could say Barry is funnier than Mel, and then we'd write it as capital F, b, little m. Barry is funnier than Mel. Linda is angry at mom. The United States is diverse. The United States is more diverser than Japan, right? All of these are pretty following the same basic pattern. Janet is giving. We can call somebody a giving person, but we could also say Janet gives Mike to Serena. Say Mike is Janet's dog, right? So Janet gives Mike to Serena is a multiplace predicate. All right, so earlier we said that predicate logic is an extension of propositional logic. So what do we mean by that? Well, what we mean is that basically everything we learned about propositional logic and the propositional calculus applies to predicate logic as well. There's nothing in propositional logic that isn't part of predicate logic. So, for example, if you wrote, we could write a sentence like this: if FA, then P or Q. And as long as P and Q are meant to stand for whole propositions the way we're used to, this would actually be a well-formed formula. Now, if P or Q were meant to be predicates, it wouldn't be a well-formed formula because you can't just write a predicate without a name in predicate logic. And also, the proof procedures from propositional calculus work as well. So there are actually some proofs that we can do right now that involve predicate logic, just using the apparatus from propositional calculus. So, if you take an English language argument in standard form like this, I could give this to you and say translate it into propositional logic. Most of you would have no trouble with this. So if Bob hits on Sarah, then Myrtle is jealous and angry. If Myrtle is jealous, then Sarah is not entertained, or is entertained. If Sarah is frightened, then Sarah is not entertained. Therefore, either Bob does not hit on Sarah or Sarah is not frightened. So if you took a moment to translate that on this side in propositional logic, it would look like this: if B, then J and A; if J, then E; if F, then not E, not B, or not F. But you can also now, if you want to, translate this into predicate logic. So HBS, Bob hits on Sarah, then, right, Myrtle is jealous and Myrtle is angry. If Myrtle is jealous, then Sarah is entertained. If Sarah is frightened, then Sarah is not entertained. So either Bob does not hit on Sarah, or it's not the case that Sarah is frightened. Okay, so you have the ability to do both of these now. And what's interesting is that we can just, since we can prove this, right, you would have no trouble proving this, you would also have no trouble proving this. And that's because this formulation in predicate logic is actually a substitution instance of the argument in propositional logic. So this is what it would look like. We won't go through the proof. There's nothing magical about it. but the proof would just proceed just as if each one of these terms were thought of as propositional logic. So this is one of those cute proofs where we treat the disjunction as a conditional. So I hypothesize HBS, derive not FS, treating each one of these, HBS, JM, AM, AS, all as if they were just the P's and Q's of propositional logic. So you should convince yourself that you can do that. I don't think you will have any trouble with it at all, as long as you are already familiar with the procedures of propositional calculus. Okay, so nevertheless, there's tons of arguments that we can't prove yet. And like the first one that we started this lecture out with, all birds have wings, some birds can't fly, therefore some winged things can't fly. So far, we have no idea how to prove this, and we have to go on to develop the predicate calculus ultimately in order to do that. So that's kind of our long-term project. So in the next section, we'll introduce the existential and universal quantifiers, and that's not the calculus yet. That's just more of the predicate logic, but ultimately these will be integrated into the predicate calculus with new proof procedures, only a few actually, as it turns out, and we'll finally be able to prove arguments like this one. Okay, so we'll go ahead and do some study questions now, and these are just to make sure you understand how to do some really basic translations of the kind we worked on.